Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with Empire of Liberty, a history of the early republic, 1789 to 1815, by Gordon S. Wood. This work of history was originally published in 2009. I read this a while back. It's really stuck with me though because I just took so much from it. It's part of the Oxford History of the United States series of books. So, yeah, I really did enjoy this read a lot. So, yeah, I've been kind of going through a colonial history, a U.S. colonial history phase. This is not really the colonial period, though. This is the period sort of right after, well, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution in 1789, all the way through the end of the War of 1812 and around 1815. So the country was already established because the revolution had been completed. The government of the states at that point, up until this point, had been, after the revolution up to this point, I mean, to say, had been through the Articles of Confederation. And so the Constitution, the states realized they needed some sort of better structure to govern themselves. And so the Constitution sort of came out of that effort. But the really interesting thing to me about this time is that the national identity, what we can still recognize today, was being developed at that time. And it really revolved around egalitarianism. And, I think that I had not really understood how the idea of equality was so new ish, like to people at the time, and how widespread it became in the US, and how that was quite different from how it was viewed historically, as well as in present day, in the time of this book, of in like places like England and the rest of Europe. Granted, this was also the time of the French Revolution, so they did have a sort of egalitarian movement in France itself as well, but it transpired quite a bit differently there. But this idea of egalitarianism really spread through the whole culture, and it impacted so many things. And so whether or not I think it's kind of chicken and egg, and I don't think the book really described it or really answered this question. Was it the idea of egalitarianism that led to the revolution, or did the revolution feed the idea of egalitarianism? I mean, I think it's maybe a little bit of both, but you can definitely say that the process got accelerated after the war, and the Americans found themselves needing to figure out a government to sort of efficiently govern themselves. So there was some tensions there about what the government was going to look like. And the government, actually, the tensions that were there at the time, we still have in certain forms today. And the tensions are between an idea of more diffuse distribution of power, meaning power to individuals, versus a centralized sort of power of like control of government. So more populism versus more sort of more federalism. So the Federalists were the parties up until this point had not existed, but they did come to exist. And the parties at the time were the Federalist Party, and then the Democratic Republicans, the Republican Party. Now we got to be careful though to the philosophies of the current Democrats and Republicans has switched over time, and so who was populist at one point in history is more of the Federalist side at another point in history. So, but at this point in time, we had the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans. Republicanism was this sort of populist idea that more power should be in the hands of the state or in the hands of individuals, and less power in the hands of a central government. They felt the central government would be oppressed. However, the Federalists, people like John Adams, would argue that there's a danger in populism, and the French Revolution was one of their prime examples of how populism and rule by the masses can go wrong. And so I didn't mention it, but the Republicans the republicanism was championed by Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were friends, but they were sort of the two poles of the political philosophy that was competing for the attention of the American people. So I just thought that that whole tension was fascinating because it impacted everything. So one of the big things that's talked about in the book is the judiciary. So the judiciary was a big point of contention. The law system of the U.S., of course, was still being developed. So we had no longer had the English system, so we were developing our own system. But the system of the judiciary and how independent it should be of both the government and of the people. So there was an argument from the republicanism side. The Republican side was that the like judges should be elected, but then in the idea of the Federalists, it's like that is a recipe for disaster because power would then could be consolidated into the wrong hands. So they had this sort of fear that this would happen, the sort of a mob rule would take over, and so they were very concerned about that. I just really got a sense, though, from reading this book, how like the continuum of history, like the aristocratic sort of rule was the norm in history. So that was the default. So that's the status quo, really. The more radical thing at the time would have been the republicanism, which was sort of taking a chance on more individuality. But yeah, so the middling sort. So egalitarianism had all sorts of ramifications in the United States, economically and socially and religiously. Americans started to take control of their own sort of destinies, and there became this sort of economic competition because there was so much fluidity in the United States, and there was so much need for like skilled craftsmen and whatnot. So people were like skilled across many different skill sets, right? Like if you can work on a wagon, you can also do blacksmithing. So kind of a jack of all trades. That was very kind of common, and people moved around that way. Rising middle class. Also, education became very much more widespread. And then self education became a cultural norm in the US. And it was really heavily influenced by the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. But Franklin and his writings, I think, had a huge impact on the thinking of American sort of industriousness and how to improve yourself. And improvement societies and all sorts of associations popped up all over the place. The other thing was that due to the rise of literacy and the postal service that also Benjamin Franklin was involved with developing, newspapers became spread out everywhere, including like on the frontier and stuff. So newspapers were widely available. So this sort of new sort of technology of newspapers in really every person's hand, newspapers would be passed around and read in like public places like bars and stuff. And so that sort of information dump, it sort of reminded me of the present day, with our digital era and our social media era being this sort of info dump, and how it changes culture when there's suddenly this widespread dissemination of all sorts of information, both good and bad, fake news and real news. So yeah, what else was I going to say? So about the South. So I mentioned how like fluid, like how the industriousness really started to really just catch on, and the middle class started to grow. This was not the case so much in the South. There's a really interesting quote about the development of slavery, how it's the perception of slavery changed here at this point. And the quote says, "But the revolution did accomplish a great deal. It created for the first time in American history the cultural atmosphere that made African American slavery abhorrent to many Americans. By attacking slavery more fiercely than ever before, revolutionary Americans freed tens of thousands of slaves. But the revolution's libertarian and egalitarian message had perverse consequences. It forced those Southerners who chose to retain slavery to fall back on the alleged racial deficiencies of blacks as a justification for an institution that hitherto they had taken for granted. So I mentioned like the default of the Federalists had been sort of this aristocratic rule had been the default in history. Slavery had also been a default in history. So thinking of slavery as abhorrent because of egalitarian values changed the views of the Southerners then, who thought up new ways to justify their system because it was built into their economic system. So I thought that was super interesting. There's another quote about servants, how the lingo, how we describe servants in the US changed as opposed to in England. And the quote says, controlling or even finding servants was difficult in this egalitarian atmosphere, with some Americans concluding that the practice of keeping servants was highly anti Republican. Servants resisted the implication of the status. They refused to call their employers master or mistress. For many, the term boss, derived from the Dutch word for master, became a euphemistic substitute. A minister in Maine favored the euphemism help applied to a domestic maid he admired because, unlike the word servant, it implied a sense of independence and hope of rising in the world. And of course, that's still the word we use most of the time when we have someone help us out in our house or in our in domestic life, especially. We will call it help, not a servant in the U.S. So I thought that was super cool. I'm going to run out of time, but just some other sort of things like the birth of public opinion. Public opinion, the idea of public opinion, like the public had an opinion that mattered, was also fairly new in the newspaper. The rise of newspapers and pamphleteering sort of also fed that phenomenon. This painting that's the cover of the book, I just thought this was so cool. I looked it up. The painting, it's actually an engraving from 1796, and it's called Liberty in the Form of the Goddess of Youth Giving Support to the Bald Eagle. I think that's so cool. I love that. Yeah, so there was, there was just changes everywhere. Religion became very. This was the beginning of the camp meeting movement. So this sort of people taking their religion into their own hands, whereas before this had been a very structured and sort of aristocratic, controlled by the aristocratic sort of functions of society. It became very populist at this point. Yeah, I think I'll leave the chat there. We could talk about a ton more stuff from this book because it was just so rich and I enjoyed reading it very much. But I'll have a similar book by Gordon S. Wood. I've already finished it a while back, and I'll get a chat on it soon about the specific friendship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and the republicanism versus the federalism of each. So more to come on that. Until next time, take care. Bye.